Okay, so the first model of the Trinity we're going to look at after the paradoxical model is one that has some similarities to modalism in the ancient tradition. We're going to call it neo-modalism because it was pushed by Karl Barth and to some extent by Karl Rahner. Barth was broadly in the Reformed tradition, Rahner in the Catholic tradition, but both very concerned to kind of reintroduce Trinitarianism to the Western tradition and to really mine the concept of the Trinity for a better and more robust doctrine of God. So the neo-modal view, the way that Barth will discuss the Trinity, is one God in three modes of being. Okay, one God, three modes of being. And the different modes of being are, fatherness, sonness, and spiritness, sort of. Meaning that God, God is always for and repeating the self-giving love that we associate with the cross. But when that self-giving, self-sacrificial love is being expressed, that's the mode of being the second person. That's the second person's mode of being, this self-giving, self-sacrificial love that we see at the cross. Now, God eternally is in all of God's self, always self-giving, self-sacrificial love, of course. That's just God's nature. But we can associate that specifically in the economic realm with Jesus of Nazareth, and in the immanent realm with the second person of the Trinity, the Son. And so, when God's eternal self-sacrificial love is a function of God's second mode of being. Likewise, God's willing the good, right? Is directing and willing the good. That's something that the Godhead eternally in all of God's fullness is always willing. Yes, but that mode of being is the mode of the Father. It's the mode of Yahweh, God of Israel. Yahweh, God of Israel, God the Father, is directing and willing the good of the universe, the creation, and even God's self. And so the willing of God is the first mode of being, and that willing leads to, or that willing emphasizes the second mode of being's self-giving, self-sacrificial love, right? So God is eternally willing that God be self-sacrificial and self-giving, but we can analyze those in two modes of being, the first being the willing, and the second mode of being being the self-sacrificial love, the first being the Father, the second being the Son. And yet, in all of the Father's fatherness and all of the Son's sonness, there is the one God who is eternally willing the good and eternally self-sacrificially giving. Okay? Now, to bring that down to a more palatable, maybe less abstract way of thinking about it, I want you to look at this person. This is one man, and you can tell because I'm such a good artist that that's Bill Gates. Bill Gates, as you may know, is the founder and CEO of a very large corporation, Microsoft, right? And so as Bill Gates goes about his day, a very large portion of his day involves CEOing. Right? He's CEOing. That is bad. That's a bad E. Let's try that again. Now notice CEOing is it's an act that comes out of Bill Gates' being, right? Bill Gates' being is not summed up in CEOing, but when Bill Gates CEOs, Bill Gates is expressing in action a part of Bill Gates' eternal being. But that's not all Bill Gates does. In fact, some parts of Bill Gates' day is spent familying. Bill Gates, I don't know if this is true or not, but I think Bill Gates is married and has kids. If he doesn't, then maybe he's got other family. But presumably at some point during the day, Bill Gates spends time familying, being a part of family, acting as a father, a husband, whatever. Again, this is not, you can't reduce Bill Gates to being a family man, but when Bill Gates is familying, he's expressing an essential part of his being in action. Okay? And so part of what it means to be Bill Gates is to go and family with his family. Turns out Bill Gates has another thing that Bill Gates likes to do, and that is that Bill Gates spends a significant amount of time each day philanthropizing. That may not be a word, but I don't think any of these are words, so it's okay. Philanthropizing. This is the time that Bill Gates spends working on the Bill Gates Foundation, which is a charitable enterprise. And you couldn't say that Bill Gates, you could say Bill Gates is a philanthropist, but you couldn't say that that's all Bill Gates is. It's true that being a philanthropist is an expression in action of something, of a portion or something of Bill Gates' being, but it's not the totality. In the same way that you couldn't say Bill Gates is CEO and be done with it. That doesn't capture all of Bill Gates. Nor could you say Bill Gates is a family man and capture all of Bill Gates. None of these facets, none of these actions, none of these modes of being, right, fully express Bill Gatesness, but all of them are essential to what it is to be Bill Gates. And so if Bill Gates is to be Bill Gates, he must CEO, he must family, and he must philanthropize. Similarly, the Godhead on a neo-modal view must Father, must Son, and must Spirit. And if you verb those ideas, the idea of God expressing God's provision, care, whatever, in the world, that would be God fathering. Now, that's not the totality of who God is, but it is an essential and non-negotiable and necessary expression in action of God's divine being. Similarly, God is saving, right? God saves, God liberates, God rescues. These are non-negotiable, essential facets of God's being. Wherever God goes, there is freedom, okay? And God does whatever it is that's necessary to create freedom. So God is a freeing God. That is a mode of God's being. It's not all God is. You can't sum up God in liberation, freedom, saving, rescuing. But it's essential to who God is, and it is a part. It is an essential expression of God's active divine being. And so wherever God is, God will be freeing, right? And you could do this with any of the attributes of God's character. Okay, notice that this is different than the attributes, right? God's attributes are full across the three modes of being. Instead, the modes of being are expressions in the economic and immanent trinity of God's character. And so God, so we would say that the Father is the one who's willing the good. The Son is the one who's saving and freeing. The Spirit is the one who's actualizing the Son's liberation and redemption, etc. And in every case, the key to remember is that modes of being means action. Okay, now you need to, this is very, very important because this is in one way that neo-modalism is an advance, I think, on classical modalism, which was a heresy. And namely that the Barthian and Rawnerian, and really pretty much any Trinitarian theology in the 20th century or after, really makes a big deal out of God not being static, but being dynamic. God is not eternally, even the word stagnant is pejorative, but God is not eternally, God is eternally in action. You cannot have, if something isn't happening, it's not God. If that makes sense. God's being is action. And so Karl Barth said God's being is in act. God's godness can only be expressed by God doing something. Doesn't mean that God doesn't have like an internal set of states and intentions, but it does mean that wherever God is, there's a manifestation of God's being, because God is a being in act. And Barth explains this Trinitarianly by suggesting God has three modes of being, three modes of action, three persons, if you will. He doesn't love the term persons, but the three persons of the Trinity actualize different facets of God's being in act. That's neo-modalism. You can see that when you're analyzing it, you'll notice that this, I've given it as much of a threeness as you possibly can. But remember, there's only one guy here, right? And if you really investigate the model, it does seem like CEO is an aspect of Bill Gates, not a person, right? It does seem that familying is an aspect of Bill Gates, not a person. And philanthropizing is an action or an aspect that Bill Gates engages in. But you can't sum up Bill Gates, or you can't say that the fullness of Bill Gates is present in philanthropizing, right? And this is where it gets a little tricky, and this is where the model tends to move towards oneness, because you kind of want to say that the fullness of the Godhead is present and expressed in the Son, right? You don't want to say that the Son is only like a third of the Godhead. But on this model, it looks like, each one of these is kind of a third, and you put them all together and you've got a whole Bill Gates, a whole God. And Bart's aware of this, and he goes out of his way to emphasize the way that each one of these is a repetition of the others, right? So he'll even kind of say that God's CEOing is God's familying and God's philanthropizing. And likewise, that God's willing is a self-sacrificial love. That God's self-sacrificial love is a will to the good. So there's no aspect of what Jesus is doing that isn't what the Father is doing or what the Spirit's doing. And so Bart really does try to build into the model a sense of the fullness of each one of these being there. But at the same time, it would be very difficult to say that the mode of being of the second person of the Trinity, fully encapsulates everything of the Godhead. Maybe. Bottom line, neo-modalism tends to, like classical modalism, devolve into a very monotheistic way of doing Trinity, and ultimately neo-modal models push against strong senses of the threeness of God. And that's why they'll either appear to be aspects, or it'll look like CEOing is the same thing as family, it was the same thing as philanthropizing, which would make these not really aspects, but all the same thing, all a full encapsulation of Bill Gates. Your mileage may vary. Whatever the case, you can see, though, that neo-modalism is a really good attempt to answer this question: how can be God one and three? Well, in the same way that Bill Gates can be CEO, family man, and philanthropist, so can God be Father, Son, and Spirit. Each of God's modes of being is distinct from each other, and yet full and true expressions of the divine nature.